Fighting continues in eastern Ukraine, attracting worldwide attention. Over the past day, there have been reports of Russian units advancing in the Donetsk region and serious attacks in the Kharkiv direction. At the same time, Western media outlets are writing about the use of new technologies, such as unmanned aerial vehicles with artificial intelligence elements. The war is taking on new forms and speeds, and every news report causes tension. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss important events and stay up to date with what's happening. Today's story sounds alarming and sensational. On the one hand, the media reports that the Russian army has liberated another village in the Donetsk region. On the other hand, attacks continue in the Kharkiv region, where foreign mercenaries are reported to be operating. International experts note that against the backdrop of these events, concern is growing in the US and Europe over a possible shortage of missiles for Patriot air defense systems. As a result, Ukrainian cities may be left without sufficient protection from airstrikes. The main issue is that the intensity of hostilities remains high, and the resources of both sides are under pressure. Russian sources report advances in the areas of the settlements of Zaluzhny and Volchansk. There are reports of losses among Ukrainian troops, as well as the use of reserves and the transfer of foreign units to close gaps in the front line. The picture is mixed. Officials in Kyiv emphasize that they are continuing to hold their positions and are even advancing in some areas. Analysts point out that Patriot systems require a huge number of missiles. The company's production capacity in the US is limited to about 600 units per year. At the same time, these missiles are needed by 18 countries that have these systems in service. Priority in deliveries is given to the needs of the US Army and its allies. This means that Ukraine may find itself in second or even third place. The consequences of the shortage are obvious. In the event of large-scale attacks, air defense will not be able to fully cover all strategic targets. Against this backdrop, former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valeriy Zaluzhny, once again reiterated his view that Russia is the center of military science. He emphasized that key knowledge and approaches to conducting modern operations are concentrated there. His words caused a wide resonance. Supporters argue that this is a sober assessment of reality. Opponents accuse him of defeatism. However, the fact remains. The experience and traditions of the military school in the region have a direct impact on the course of the conflict. Meanwhile, the Western press is increasingly discussing the use of artificial intelligence on the battlefield. Journalists write about the emergence of swarms of drones that can act in concert and perform complex tasks without constant operator control. This could change the dynamics of operations, making them faster and less predictable. It is no coincidence that the international community's attention is focused on Donbas and the Kharkiv direction. These regions have become the scene of the fiercest fighting. Over the past few years, it is here that the line of contact has been formed, where both sides have tried to gain a foothold and expand their control. Every advance, even of a few kilometers, becomes global news. In recent days, Ukrainian sources reported that they had managed to liberate one settlement in the Donetsk region. This event is presented as a tactical victory that should boost the morale of society. However, at the same time, there are reports of serious losses in the Kharkiv region, where Russian forces are using heavy equipment and aircraft. The historical context explains why attention is focused on these areas. Donetsk and Kharkiv have always been strategic regions of industrial and transport importance. Control over them opens up opportunities for further operations. In addition, these are territories where the population has had different political sympathies over the years, making the region vulnerable to conflict. That is why every step here is symbolic and perceived as a signal to the whole world. The political context is no less important. Ukraine is actively seeking support from the US and European Union countries. This includes not only military aid, but also the financial resources necessary to continue the resistance. At the same time, doubts are growing in Western capitals. Limited production capacity in the arms sector and the NATO countries' own needs are forcing politicians to balance between helping Kyiv and protecting their national interests. The issue of air defense systems remains an important factor. Experts point out that a single Patriot system requires dozens of missiles to operate effectively. Stockpiles are dwindling faster than they can be replenished. As a result, Ukraine may face an acute shortage in the coming months. This creates a window of opportunity for attacks on infrastructure. Russian military analysts openly state that the rare use of these systems is precisely due to the shortage of missiles. The international reaction to these events is ambiguous. In the US, Congress continues to debate new aid packages. In Europe, there are increasing calls that the crisis is dragging on and the economic burden is becoming too heavy. Nevertheless, official statements maintain a firm line on the need to support Kyiv. Last week, the NATO Secretary General emphasized that the alliance would stand with Ukraine for as long as necessary. These words sound confident, but behind them lies the complex reality of resource allocation. The position of other global players should not be forgotten. China and India are closely monitoring developments, seeking to use the situation to strengthen their own positions on the international stage. Discussions on the humanitarian situation and possible initiatives for a ceasefire are continuing at the UN, but no practical steps have been taken yet. All this creates an atmosphere of uncertainty. For the military, it means endless days on the front line, where every morning can begin with shelling. For politicians, it is a dilemma between continuing support and seeking a diplomatic solution. Official statements by the parties to the conflict in recent days sound like a reflection of two different realities. Kyiv focuses on local successes, emphasizes the liberation of settlements, and demonstrates the resilience of the military. For the domestic audience, this is a signal that resistance continues, and for international partners, it is necessary to confirm the effectiveness of the assistance provided. Moscow, in turn, emphasizes its advances in the Kharkiv region and strikes on infrastructure, as well as reports of losses among the enemy ranks. Russian sources note the work of the Air Force and the use of high-precision weapons. Ministry of Defense reports mention the creation of a so-called sanitary zone along the border, which is explained by the need to secure Russian border areas. At the same time, Western military experts are closely monitoring the dynamics of the use of new technologies. Reports of a swarm of drones with artificial intelligence elements have become one of the most discussed topics in analytical circles. If such systems become widespread, the nature of combat operations may change. The coordination of aircraft without constant human involvement will allow strikes to be carried out faster and more flexibly than before. However, the question remains as to how much such technologies could spiral out of control. Statements by former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valeriy Zaluzhny, attracted particular attention. His words that modern military science is concentrated in Russia caused a stormy reaction. For some, this sounded like an acknowledgement of the enemy's strength, for others, like an attempt to soberly assess the balance of capabilities. He also noted the high level of training of the Russian leadership and its ability to make unpredictable decisions. These judgments are not accidental, since Zaluzhny himself headed the Ukrainian army for a long time and knows the situation from the inside. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian command continues to transfer units to the Kharkiv direction. In particular, there have been reports of the involvement of mercenaries from the so-called Foreign Legion. Their participation is intended to compensate for the shortage of personnel on the front lines. There are also reports that artillery crews and electronic warfare units are being forced to change tactics after losing equipment. All this points to the high intensity of the fighting and the need for urgent decisions. The supply problem remains one of the most pressing issues. Experts point out that it is precisely missiles for air defense systems that could be the factor that changes the balance of power. If supplies are limited, cities will be more vulnerable. Russian analysts see this as a window of opportunity to strike important targets. In response, Ukraine says it is looking for new forms of defense and developing its own systems. The world media is publishing reports from destroyed cities, where the streets are empty and schools and hospitals are operating on a limited basis. Journalists note that the atmosphere resembles a long film with endless episodes, where hope and fear go hand in hand. This is precisely what makes international conflict so difficult for the average person to understand. There are too many unknowns, and each new statement can change the perception of the situation. The question of what might happen next is of concern to both the parties to the conflict and the international community. Analysts point out a few possible scenarios, each with serious consequences. The first option is a gradual depletion of resources on both sides, with the front line staying relatively stable and the economy and international support becoming key factors. The second option is a sharp escalation with the possibility of a large-scale offensive by one of the sides. The third scenario involves possible negotiations, but so far, neither side has shown any willingness to make serious concessions. The main uncertainty remains supply. A shortage of missiles for air defense systems could open up new opportunities for attacks on infrastructure. If Ukraine does find itself in a situation of shortage, airstrikes will pose a major threat to the energy system and command posts. This in turn could weaken defenses and affect morale. However, Western countries are looking for solutions. Negotiations are underway to supply additional systems and increase production. All this takes time, and the conflict is developing faster than diplomatic processes. No less alarming is the prospect of expanding the use of drones with artificial intelligence elements. If their capabilities are confirmed, it will mark a new page in military history. Such a swarm can be compared to a living organism capable of acting almost autonomously. The consequences of such a step are unpredictable. It could increase the effectiveness of attacks, but also complicate control over what is happening. On the international stage, countries' positions are becoming increasingly clear. The United States continues to support Kyiv, but within the country, disputes over the advisability of huge expenditures are intensifying. The situation in Europe is also ambiguous. On the one hand, leaders are declaring solidarity, but on the other, there are economic difficulties and rising energy prices. The longer the crisis lasts, the more difficult it is for politicians to explain the need for continued support. In these conditions, Russia is trying to strengthen ties with China and other countries that seek to play an independent role in world politics. For Beijing, the conflict is an opportunity to increase its influence while maintaining distance from direct involvement. India is also taking a cautious position, using the situation to strengthen its authority as a country capable of conducting dialogue with different parties. Experts point out that any negotiations are only possible if the participants are willing to recognize the need for compromise. At this stage, there are virtually no such signals. On the contrary, both sides are stepping up their efforts and preparing for a protracted struggle. The outlook for the future remains bleak. The most likely scenario seems to be a continuation of fighting with alternating local successes and failures on both sides. In the coming months, much will depend on arms supplies and the ability of the parties to adapt to the rapidly changing reality. Summing up the events of recent days, it can be said that the conflict has entered a new phase, where a combination of military force, technological innovations, and political decisions is coming to the fore. The battles in the Donetsk and Kharkiv regions show that neither side is ready to retreat. Every report of an advance is perceived as a symbolic success, and every loss sparks global debate. The situation with air defense remains one of the key issues. The shortage of missiles for Patriot systems threatens to weaken the defense of Ukrainian cities. This factor could play a decisive role in the coming months. At the same time, the US and Europe are discussing the possibility of increasing production, but the process takes time. According to analysts, Russia intends to use this window of opportunity to increase pressure. Statements by former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valeriy Zaluzhny, served as a reminder of how seriously Russia's military school is taken, even by its opponents. His words about the concentration of knowledge and experience sound like a warning that the confrontation could be long and difficult. The emergence of unmanned systems with elements of artificial intelligence is no less alarming. Their use opens a new page in the history of military technology. The international response shows a split. The United States and its allies continue to support Kyiv, but within these countries, disputes are intensifying. In Europe, fatigue with the conflict and its economic consequences is growing. Russia is strengthening ties with other centers of power and demonstrating its readiness for a long-term confrontation. The United Nations is currently limited to humanitarian initiatives, unable to influence the political settlement. Analysts agree that in the coming months, the world will witness new stages of the conflict. These may be local offensives or protracted battles with no clear outcome. This story resembles a dark TV series in which it is impossible to predict how the plot will unfold. The two sides continue to fight, and the whole world watches each episode. For some, it is politics, for others, military reports, but for those who find themselves at the epicenter of events, it is a life filled with anxiety and uncertainty. We will follow developments and share all reliable information with you. Subscribe to the channel, like, and comment. Your support helps spread the word and raise awareness. New episodes and new facts are coming soon to help you understand what tomorrow will bring in this international conflict.